Hello everybody, Thrash Til Death here. Well, it's been a few weeks now since I put up my top 5 of 2010 video, and we're now well and properly into 2011, halfway through February. So I've been meaning now to get down to doing a regular slew of album reviews, and I've got, with companies and record labels releasing new albums left, right and centre, I've got a big backlog of stuff to get through. So my first album for 2010 to review is Sounds of Violence by Onslaught. Now, talking about Onslaught, this is a band with a bit of a history. Now, British heavy metal, we had a bit of a run through from the early 70s through to the early 80s. We gave the world Black Sabbath, we gave the world Judas Priest, we gave the world Iron Maiden and the whole NWBHM movement. But when thrash metal came along in the mid to late 80s, that was really sort of America's time. That British bands never really got in that whole movement, and we sort of sat that one out. In pretty much all throughout the 80s, there were only two noteworthy British thrash metal bands. One was Xentrix, who played from about 1987, I think, through to about 1996, when they split up after the absolutely god-awful album Scourge. They haven't been heard from since. The other was Onslaught themselves, who played a bunch of very fast and dark thrash metal albums in the 80s, in sort of the vein of Creator, Sodom, Destruction, all that sort of band. And they split up with sort of the arrival of the 90s and the rise of grunge and Britpop and all that. But with all the thrash metal bands coming back now in the sort of late 30s, early 40s, with the revival of the thrash movement that this last decade has seen, Onslaught were one of the bands who came back in 2007. They revived themselves with their album Killing Peace back in 2007. That was released to fairly lukewarm reviews at the time. And now, 3 years out on, we've got Sounds of Violence. Now, listening to this album, you can tell that the genealogy going on from the 80s, this sounds almost sort of like the last 20 years never really happened. It sounds like the sort of intermediate stage between full-on riffs down your throat thrash metal and the sort of more mid-paced, groove-oriented sort of Latter-day Testament, Pantera, Latter-day Sepultura sort of almost half thrash sort of sound that a lot of bands were experimenting with in the early 90s. And I'll just say straight away that this is a good album. It's well played, it's well performed, and it's well recorded, and there's a lot of energy on display throughout the songs. Very heavy choruses, very heavy riffs, lots of really well played solos, all the sort of all the checklist elements of what constitutes a good thrash metal album are there. Fast-paced songs mixed with a few slower ones. Whole album only lasts around 40-45 minutes, but you know, it doesn't outlast its welcome. It's dark, it's heavy, and it's probably one of the more extreme thrash metal albums on the market in the whole revival movement. With that said, I have to say that this album didn't really inspire me that much. I find that there's a certain X factor, not the TV show, the sort of the inexplicable element to a lot of older thrash metal. A lot of it has to do with 80s production values. When you listen to bands like Dark Angel or Morbid Saint or even early day Slayer, a lot of those bands have something very feral and rabid and very primal to their sound. And a lot of that's sort of hard to replicate with the sort of high polish and production values that bands have today. And that's sort of a large part of the thrash metal revival movement that I object to. A lot of older bands who are trying to come back and revive themselves, being just as aggressive and full on as they were in the 80s, end up sounding just a little bit blasé, end up sounding just a little bit worn almost. Onslaught, they fall into the same trap that's afflicted Creator and other bands of that ilk. I just felt that as well played as this album is and as professional as it sounds, it sort of misses the mark. It's, while the solos on this album were well played, I never felt like, holy shit, that solo just blindsided me out of nowhere. I never sort of felt like really energized or caught off guard by any individual element of this album. And while it's all very well constructed and very well written, it's all just a little bit too predictable, a little bit too commonplace. Just doesn't have that sort of raw energy and magic to it, the sort of sound of that this is music that you would summon Satan to. It is played with considerable gusto, and you can tell that the band members are putting their hearts and souls into this, particularly with the vocals, which are very raw and throat-shredding. But even so, it just doesn't have that missing element. You listen to this album juxtaposed with something like Morbid Saint's Spectrum of Death from 1989. Was Spectrum of Death 1989? I'll have to look it up. But yeah, it's just there's something missing. There's just not that sort of spark of raw primal aggression. And I think that's something that we can't really recapture. Thrash is something that's come and gone, and I think almost it would be better to leave it lie. While a lot of these reunions are very accomplished, and a lot of them, they aren't unwelcome, but I think it's sort of time for metal to move on to other things, something more in line with modern production techniques, than trying to sort of recreate the glories of the past. And for that reason, Onslaught's Sounds of Violence doesn't really do much for me. With that said, not a bad album, not an incompetent album by any means, and it is definitely a fun listen. And even if it's not the most inspiring album in the world, it's still definitely a fairly energetic way of passing 45 minutes. So give it a listen if you're sort of starved for thrash metal and you've completely exhausted the back catalogue of the 80s. But really, you'd probably be better off just listening to, I don't know, Creator, Pleasure to Kill from 86. Anything from 86 pretty much blows this out of the water, and all the great thrash riffs have already been written and played. So unless you've already heard everything that the 80s has to offer, there's not really much purpose to this album. It's kind of redundant. So that's my 2 cents on Onslaught. Fine, inoffensive, heavy, perfectly aggressive, and fulfills all the sort of requirements that are asked of it, but that key element is just sort of missing. Anyway, that's me for now. I'm Thrash Til Death, and I'll be seeing you soon. Goodbye.